Over the course of several years of doing extensive research, I have collected a variety of puzzle pieces about different places that bring a bigger picture into focus that is not immediately apparent on the surface. This includes, but is not limited to, extensive research of cities and places in linear and circular alignment with each other across long distances, places that viewers have suggested that I look into, and research into seeing the events of our modern history since 1945 with new eyes. I have found puzzle pieces about places like Japan that specifically relate to not only the foreign involvement in the development of Japan's military empire of the late 19th century to the mid-20th century in our historical narrative, and in its being dismantled. I have found the same foreign involvement taking place in other countries as well, in a way that events seem to have been orchestrated and manipulated for desired outcomes and setting the stage for future events. I will bring in other countries that experienced similar foreign involvement, but my main focus will be on the example of Japan. My name is Michelle Gibson. Commodore Matthew C. Perry led 4 ships into Tokyo Bay's harbor on July 8th of 1853 in an effort to reestablish regular trade and discourse between Japan and the Western world for the first time in 200 years. Commodore Perry was ordered by President Millard Fillmore to Tokyo Bay with the mission of forcing the opening of Japanese ports to American trade by any means necessary. Millard Fillmore had been the vice president in the administration of President Zachary Taylor, the 12th president of the United States, whose term started in March of 1849. A hero from the Mexican-American War, General Zachary Taylor died only a short time after that, in July of 1850, allegedly after consuming copious amounts of raw fruit and iced milk at a July 4th fundraising event at the Washington Monument. President Taylor became severely ill and died several days later, and Millard Fillmore became the 13th President of the United States, serving as President from July 10th of 1850 to March 3rd of 1853. Sounds like there might perhaps be more to the story than that, though after exhuming his remains in 1991, a coroner found traces of arsenic, but ruled there was not enough to conclusively support poisoning as his cause of death, and he was reinterred. Regardless, still seems rather suspicious, even after all these years have passed. At any rate, reasons given for the interest of the United States in establishing a relationship with Japan included, but were not limited to, 1. The opening of China's ports to regular trade, and the annexation of California, which had created an American port on the Pacific Ocean for increased trade between North America and Asia, and 2. The replacement of the sailing ships of these American traders with steamships necessitated the securing of coal supply stations, which Japan was believed to have vast deposits of. With regards to the opening of Chinese ports to the United States just referenced, this took place under Caleb Cushing, appointed by President John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, as ambassador to China in 1843, a position which he held until March 4th of 1845. The Cushing mission to China, arriving in Macau in February of 1844, consisted of 4 American warships, which were loaded with gifts and devices like telescopes and revolvers, in the hopes of impressing the Royal Chinese court. When the Chinese were not inclined to receive Cushing as an envoy, Cushing threatened with the U.S. warships in his entourage to go directly to the Chinese emperor. This tactic resulted in the Chinese emperor negotiating with Cushing and the Treaty of WWII, also known as the Treaty of Peace, Amity, and Commerce between the United States and the Chinese Empire in 1844. Within 6 years of the signing of the Treaty of WWII, China was enmeshed in the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war between 1850 and 1864. This was a civil war between the established Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, and Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, an unrecognized oppositional state in China supporting the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. Though we are told the Qing dynasty ultimately defeated the opposing forces with the eventual help of British and French forces, the Taiping Rebellion left the economic heartland of China in the central and lower Yangtze River basins in ruins, and millions of people lost their lives as a result of it, as well as that in Western eyes, China was marked as poor and backwards. The Daoguang Depression took place in China between 1820 and 1850, a prolonged economic decline that coincided with the 2 most traumatic events of the 19th century in China. The First Opium War, and the Taiping Rebellion, and was a reason for the beginning of Chinese immigration to the United States in the 1840s, from which Chinese immigrants supplied labor for America's growing industry in the form of workers for mines, factories, textile mills, and the railroad. The First Opium War was fought between the Qing dynasty of China and Britain between 1839 and 1842, a military engagement that started when the Chinese seized opium stocks at Canton in order to stop the opium trade, which was banned. The British government insisted upon free trade and equality among nations and backed the merchants' demands. From 1757 to 1842, the Canton system served as a means for China to control trade with the West by focusing all trade in the southern port of Canton. To counter this, the British East India Company began to grow opium in Bengal, in present-day Bangladesh, and allowed private British merchants to sell opium to Chinese smugglers for illegal sale in China. As a result of these events in history, opium dens, establishments where opium was sold and smoked, became prevalent in many parts of the world throughout the 19th century. Some of the world's wealthiest families today earned a fortune engaging in the opium business, like the Forbes family, a wealthy American family of Scottish descent long prominent in Boston, whose original fortune came largely from trading opium and tea between North America and China in the 19th century. The Treaty of Nanjing, also known as Nanking, ended the First Opium War on August 29th of 1842, the first of what was called unequal treaties between China and foreign imperialist powers, in which China paid the British an indemnity, ceded the territory of Hong Kong to Great Britain, and agreed to establish a fair and reasonable tariff. Back to Commodore Perry and the opening of Japan. Commodore Perry stopped in the Bonin Islands in 1853, also known as the Ogasawara Islands, on his way to Tokyo Bay to open it up for trade with the West. They are comprised of over 30 tropical and subtropical islands, located south of Tokyo. There, Commodore Perry laid claim to the largest island as a United States colony, calling it the U.S. colony of Peel Island after former British Home Secretary and Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel. Perry appointed a governor for the colony, a colonist on the island since the early 1830s named Nathaniel Savory, whom he purchased land from on Peel Island for a steamship coaling location in 1853. Once Commodore Perry and his ships arrived in Tokyo Bay, Perry was allowed to land and deliver a letter with United States demands to the Tokugawa shogun, Ayoshi, but only after Perry threatened to burn Tokyo to the ground. The shogun Ayoshi died a short time after Perry's departure in July of 1853, leaving effective administration in the hands of the Council of Elders, though nominally to his sickly son, Iseda, who was the Tokugawa shogun from 1853 to 1858. The Tokugawa shogunate is called the last feudal Japanese military government. Ruling from 1600 to 1868 from Edo Castle in Tokyo. Here is a photo of one of the polygonal megalithic walls found on the grounds of Edo Castle, compared with this exquisite example of polygonal masonry at the Coricancha in Cusco, Peru. Polygonal masonry is defined as a technique where the visible surfaces of the stone are dressed with straight edges or joints, giving the stone the appearance of a polygon, with minimal clearance between stones and no mortar. Perry returned again with 8 naval vessels in February of 1854, and on March 31st of 1854, the Japanese Emperor Komei signed the Japan and United States Treaty of Peace and Amity at the Convention of Kanagawa, under threat of force if the Japanese government did not open the ports of Shimoda, located at the southern tip of the Aizu Peninsula, and central to Japan's political crisis around its inability to maintain its national seclusion policy during this time in its history, and Hakodate to American vessels, a port city located on the Tsugaru Strait of the Sea of Japan between the Japanese islands of Honshu and Hokkaido. The 5-pointed star fort of Goryukaku is located at Hakodate on Hokkaido and was said to have been built between 1855 and 1866 by the Tokugawa shogunate to protect the Tsugaru Strait from possible invasion by the Russian fleet. Goryukaku was the site of the last battle of the Boshin War that took place from December of 1868 until the end of June of 1869 between the Tokugawa shogunate and imperial forces seeking to seize power, and marked the official end of the Tokugawa shogunate as rulers of Japan. Imperial rule had been restored to Japan starting in 1868 in the form of the Emperor Meiji in a time period known in Japanese history as the Meiji Restoration, and brought in a centralized form of government in order to strengthen their army and defend against foreign influence, as we are told. Edo Castle, the star fort residence of the Tokugawa shoguns, became the imperial residence in 1871. It was during the Meiji era that Japan westernized and rapidly industrialized, leading to its rise as a military power by 1895. Thomas Glover, a Scottish merchant, supplied machinery, equipment, ships, arms, and weapons to the samurai of Choshu, Satsuma, and Tosu, who toppled the ruling Tokugawa shogunate with the fall of Edo on May 3rd of 1868. Thomas Glover had arrived in Nagasaki in 1859 as an agent for what is today known as Jardine Matheson, a British multinational trading conglomerate that was founded in 1832 and based in Hong Kong, with the majority of its business interests in Asia. The firm of Jardine Matheson and Company emerged in 1832 from an evolving process of partnership changes of foreign companies that had been first established in 1782 as Cox and Reed by John Cox and John Reed. John Reed was an agent of the Trieste Company, part of the Austrian East India Company, the catch-all term used for a series of Austrian trading companies based in Ostend and Trieste that also included the Imperial Asiatic Trading Company of Trieste and Antwerp, the origins of which started in 1775 in our historical narrative for the Habsburg monarchy government of the Empress Maria Theresa for Austria to trade with British East India Company ruled India from the Adriatic port of Trieste after a proposal to do so presented by Dutch-born British merchant William Bolts was accepted, and Bolts sailed forth with a 10-year charter allowing him to trade under imperial colors between Austria's Adriatic ports and Persia, India, China, and Africa. Two University of Edinburgh Medical School graduates, William Jardine and James Matheson, set up headquarters of the firm that had evolved from Cox and Reed in Hong Kong after it had been ceded by China to Great Britain in the 1842 Treaty of Nanjing. Jardine, Matheson and Company grew rapidly, smuggling illegal opium from British-controlled India into China, and the company has been called the most successful opium smuggling company in the world. Along with the trade in smuggled opium, as well as tea and cotton, the firm diversified into insurance, shipping, and railways. By the mid-19th century, Jardine, Matheson and Company had become the largest of the foreign trading conglomerates, with offices in all the major Chinese cities and in Japan in places like Nagasaki, where Thomas Glover had established the Glover Trading Company in 1861. Glover was credited with building the Glover House overlooking Nagasaki Iron Works in 1863 as a base for his business operations in Japan. Glover played a major role in Japan's rapidly emerging industrialization. Among other things, he was involved in establishing businesses that would become part of Mitsubishi's early growth and diversification, which included the development of the first coal mine on Takashima Island. Takashima Island was the location of the Hokai Pit, the first coal mine in Japan to be mechanized by steam engines, and which operated between 1869 and 1876, and of which there are a few visible remains you can visit on the island. Mitsubishi bought the coal mine on Takashima Island in 1881, which was the largest coal mine in Japan, and the mine was in operation until November of 1986. When I was looking for information on the Takashima coal mine, I came across this article about the investment of British capital into the development of the Takashima coal mine, which played a crucial role in the rapid industrialization of Japan. Mitsubishi was founded in 1870 under the name of Tsukumo Shokai as a shipping company by Japanese industrialist and financier Iwasaki Yataro only 2 years after the Meiji Restoration. The company's name was changed to Mitsubishi Shokai in 1873, with Mitsubishi coming from Mitsu, or 3, from the number of oak leaves on the crest, or mon in Japan, of the Yomauchi clan that ruled over Yataro's birthplace of the Tosa Peninsula, which is similar to the mon of the Tokugawa clan, called the Triple Hollyhock. And the Bishi in the company name refers to the rhombuses seen in the company's logo, known as the Three Diamonds. Mitsubishi quickly diversified into fields related to shipping. Things like entering into the coal mining business in order to gain the coal needed to fuel steamships, acquired a shipbuilding yard and an iron mill in Nagasaki to supply iron for its ships, and started a marine insurance company to insure ships, In 1884, Mitsubishi's founder Yotaro leased the Nagasaki shipyard and iron foundry from the Imperial Meiji government and entered shipbuilding on a large scale, and by 1887 had purchased these facilities outright. In 1891, Mitsubishi acquired Hashima Island in the Nagasaki Prefecture, just south of Takashima Island, and started coal mining operations there as well. Hashima Island was nicknamed Battleship Island. Mitsubishi established undersea coal mines on Hashima Island, which operated during the rapid industrialization of Japan, leading to Japan's rise as a military power, and the time period during which Japan adopted Western ideas and production methods. Between its opening in 1890 and abandonment in 1974, when the coal reserves were depleted, Mitsubishi developed a community in order to turn Hashima Island into a coal-producing powerhouse. This included thousands of forced laborers in the early 20th century, primarily from Korea. More on the issue of forced labor to work the coal mines in a moment. At the peak of its coal mining production in 1959, there were over 5,200 people living on 16 acres, or 6.3 hectares, making it the most densely populated place on Earth at the time. The First Sino-Japanese War took place between July 25th of 1894 and April 17th of 1895 between China's Qing dynasty and Japan's Meiji Empire over influence in Korea, ending when the Qing government sued for peace after months of unbroken successes by the military superiority of Japan. As a result, regional dominance in East Asia shifted from China to Japan, and Korea proclaimed its independence from China and was lost as one of China's tributary states, while Taiwan became a dependency of Japan in 1895 as a result of the First Sino-Japanese War and Japan's first colony until the surrender of Japan at the end of World War II in September of 1945. Then Japan was part of an 8-nation alliance that invaded China in 1900 during the Boxer Rebellion that took place between 1899 and 1901, with the aim of relieving foreign legations in Beijing that were besieged by the Boxer militia, who were determined to remove foreign imperialism from China. The Boxer Protocol ending the Boxer Rebellion was signed between the Qing Empire and the 8-nation alliance that provided military forces to defeat the Boxer Rebellion on September 7th of 1901 and was regarded as one of the unequal treaties. Clauses of the Boxer Protocol included the payment of 450 million taels of fine silver as an indemnity paid over 39 years to the 8 nations involved in the alliance. This equates to 333 million US dollars. Clauses also included things like the prohibition of the importation of arms and ammunition, as well as materials for the manufacture thereof, for 2 years, or longer if the powers saw fit, and the destruction of the Taku forts near Tianjin, most of which had been dismantled by the 8-nation alliance during the Boxer Rebellion. Between 1904 and 1905, the Russo-Japanese War was fought between the Russian Empire and the Japanese Empire over rival imperial ambitions in Manchuria and the Korean Empire. Japan saw Russia as a rival, fearing Russian encroachment would interfere with Japanese plans to establish a sphere of influence in both places. The name of Manchuria is said to have come into use in Europe in the 1800s. Prior to that time, the vast region depicted on the map in purple was called Chinese Tartary, and the regions in yellow were considered independent Tartary. After negotiations between Japan and Russia broke down in 1904, the Imperial Japanese Navy started hostilities by a nighttime surprise attack on the Russian Eastern Fleet in the Russian-held port of Port Arthur on the coast of Manchuria in China on February 9th of 1904. Japanese forces landed in Chongqing, in what is now North Korea, at the start of the Russo-Japanese War, and established a supply base here based on its proximity to the front lines in Manchuria. After the end of the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese remained here and declared the city an open trading port in 1908 for the transport of Korean resources to Japan and as a stopping point for resources from China. The La Perouse Strait divides the southern part of Sakhalin Island from the northern part of Hokkaido, connecting the Sea of Japan with the Sea of Okhotsk. One of the naval battles of the Russo-Japanese War took place here, the Battle of Korsakov in 1904, with the Japanese preventing a Russian cruiser from rejoining the Russian fleet in Vladivostok. The Pacific Ring of Fire passes through the Kuril Islands, which are in the vicinity. This island chain has around 100 volcanoes, with 40 being active. All of the islands are under Russian jurisdiction, however, Japan claims the 2 southernmost large islands. The Strait of Tartary divides Sakhalin Island from southeast Russia and connects the Sea of Japan with the Sea of Okhotsk. The 51st parallel north passes right through here. The capital cities of London, England, and Astana, Kazakhstan are at the same latitude as the Strait of Tartary. An interesting aside is the 51-degree pyramid, which is the angle of each of the sides of the Great Pyramid, whose proportions relate both to the human form and the geomancy of the Earth. The Korea Strait between Japan and Korea, of which the Tsushima Strait is the eastern channel, connects the Sea of Japan with the East China Sea. This is where the decisive naval battle took place during the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, where Japan destroyed Russia's naval fleet. After Japan won the Battle of Tsushima, the Russo-Japanese War was concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth on September 5th of 1905, which was mediated by President Theodore Roosevelt. With Japan's victory in this war, the balance of power in both Asia and Europe was shifted, resulting in Japan's emergence as a great power and Russia's decline in prestige and influence in Europe. After Japan emerged as the victor of the Russo-Japanese War, Imperial Japan formally annexed Korea into the Empire of Japan in 1910, and Korea was under Japanese rule between 1910 and 1945. It is estimated that during the Japanese occupation of Korea, before and during World War II, there were as many as 7.8 million Koreans conscripted as either forced labor or soldiers during Japan's imperial expansion. During World War I, Japan declared war on Germany in 1914 as an ally of Great Britain and quickly seized the German colonies in the Pacific of the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands. On September 5th of 1914, the Japanese conducted the world's first successful naval-launched air raids from the seaplane carrier Wakamiya, and on the next day, the first air-sea battle in world history took place when an aircraft launched from the Wakamiya attacked several Austro-Hungarian and German targets on sea and land. In the years between World War I and II, the Japanese developed and launched the world's first purpose-designed aircraft carrier, the Hosho, and then subsequently developed a fleet of aircraft carriers. In China, the Chinese Civil War was fought off and on between the Nationalist Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party from 1927 to 1949. Japan already controlled the area along the South Manchuria Railroad, and its army further invaded Manchuria in northeast China in 1931 after what was called the false flag Mukden incident, in which Japan claimed to have territory attacked by the Chinese and giving justification for Japan's invasion of Manchuria. Subsequently, in 1932, the Japanese established the puppet state of Manchukuo in China, which lasted until 1945, when Imperial Japan surrendered at the end of World War II. The last king emperor of China, Puyi, was installed by the Japanese as the head of state of Manchukuo in 1932, and he became its emperor in 1934, a position he held until the end of World War II. Puyi was only a figurehead, with the real authority in the hands of Japanese military authorities. Puyi's life story was very sad, as is told in the 1987 movie The Last Emperor, directed by Bernardo Bertolucci. By 1937, Japan had annexed territory north of Beijing, and after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, a battle between the Imperial Japanese Army and China's National Revolutionary Army, and regarded as the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese began a full-scale invasion of China. This led to Japanese conquests on the eastern coast of China and the occupation of Shanghai and Nanjing. The Chinese suffered greatly in both military and civilian casualties, with an estimated 300,000 killed during the Nanjing Massacre, the mass murder of Chinese civilians in the first 6 weeks of Japanese occupation, including mass rape, looting, and arson. It was considered one of the worst atrocities of World War II. The Chinese Civil War between the Chinese Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party that had started in August of 1927 was put on hold between 1937 and 1945, when the two factions united in the face of the Japanese invasion of China and the establishment of its puppet state, Manchukuo. Generally referred to as the Chinese Communist Revolution, the Communists gained control of mainland China in 1949, forcing the leadership of the Nationalist Republic of China to retreat to the island of Taiwan. In September of 1940, Japan became allies with Germany and Italy in what was called the Tripartite Pact, also known to history as the Axis, And in April of 1941, Imperial Japan and the Soviet Union signed a neutrality pact. Japan refused to withdraw from China and Indochina, and an economic embargo against Japan by the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands started in July of 1941, particularly gasoline and things like scrap metal and steel. Hideki Tojo was the Prime Minister of Japan between 1941 and 1944 during most of the Pacific War. Tojo supported a preventive war against the United States, an armed conflict initiated in the belief that, while not imminent, war was inevitable, and that to delay would involve greater risk. He oversaw Japan's decision to go to war and its conquest of much of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Tojo was arrested for war crimes in September of 1945 after Japan's unconditional surrender. He tried to commit suicide by a self-inflicted gunshot wound at the time of his arrest, but he survived, was subsequently imprisoned, tried, and executed by the end of 1948 for his crimes. Isoroku Yamamoto was a fleet admiral of the Imperial Japanese Navy and commander-in-chief of the Combined Fleet during World War II, the main seagoing component of the Imperial Navy. Yamamoto oversaw the attack on Pearl Harbor, the battles of the Coral and Java Seas, and the Battle of Midway. He was killed in April of 1943, apparently as the result of a targeted attack on his plane, as directed by American military leadership. After the surprise attack by the Japanese on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7th of 1941, the United States, United Kingdom, and other allies declared war on Japan. Initially, the Japanese encountered successes in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, capturing Hong Kong, Malaya, Thailand, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and other Pacific islands. They engaged in major offensives in Burma, and the Imperial Navy attacked Australia. The tide turned in the Allies' favor with the Battle of Midway in the middle of 1942, when the U.S. Navy defeated an attacking fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, in which considerable damage was inflicted on the Japanese fleet. While Japan did have some successes in land battles after that, from 1943 onwards, the Japanese military forces suffered major casualties and had many retreats. Throughout the course of Japan's military activity between 1937 and 1945, the Japanese were known for mistreatment of prisoners of war and civilians through forced labor and brutality. Kamikaze attacks began in October of 1944 when the war was looking bleak for Japan. Part of the Japanese special attack units of pilots flying suicide attacks against Allied naval vessels in the closing stages of the war in the Pacific. These pilots would attempt to crash their aircraft loaded with explosives into Allied ships with an estimated 19% success rate. Numbers included 3,800 such Japanese pilots killed and 7,000 Allied personnel killed as a result of these suicide attacks. Japan was unwilling to surrender, and the tradition of dying instead of defeat, capture, and shame was deeply entrenched in its military culture. There were 3 big wartime conferences held between Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union during World War II. The first was held in Tehran in November of 1943, and in which Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin committed to open a second front against Nazi Germany, 2 years after the Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran in August of 1941. The second was held in Yalta on the Crimean Peninsula in February of 1945, in which Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met to discuss the post-war reorganization of Germany and Europe. The third Big Three wartime conference was held in Potsdam, Germany, between July 17th and August 2nd in 1945. They gathered to decide how to administer Germany after its unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier, on May 8th of 1945. Franklin Roosevelt's death occurred on April 12th of 1945, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, succeeded him and represented the United States as president at the Potsdam Conference. And on July 28th, the new Prime Minister Clement Attlee replaced Winston Churchill as the representative for Great Britain at the Potsdam Conference. A number of changes had occurred since the Yalta Conference that greatly affected Big Three relations in Potsdam. By the time of the Potsdam Conference, the Soviet Union occupied Central and Eastern Europe, with the Red Army effectively controlling Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, claiming this region was a legitimate sphere of Soviet influence, as well as a defensive measure against future attacks. Outcomes of the Potsdam Conference included, but was not limited to, the division of Germany and Austria into 4 occupation zones, with their capitals of Berlin and Vienna divided into 4 zones as well. the prevention of Nazi activity and preparation for the reconstruction of Germany into a democratic state, the decision to put Nazi war criminals on trial, war reparations to Allied countries, and the dismantling of Germany's war industry. During the same time period as the Potsdam Conference, we are told the United States successfully tested the first atomic bomb on July 16th at Trinity Site near Alamogordo, New Mexico. The Potsdam Declaration was issued on July 26th, an ultimatum calling for the surrender of all Japanese forces, or Japan would face prompt and utter destruction. This is what we are told in the historical narrative. By August 5th of 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, destroying the city and killing over 70,000 people. And the second atomic bomb was dropped on the shipbuilding center of Nagasaki on August 9th, several days later, killing around the same number of people as Hiroshima. I am not in a position to say one way or another whether or not what we are told was what actually happened, because I simply don't know. What I do know is that we have been lied to, a lot, and that it is important to question everything we have ever been told about anything. Then Japan formally surrendered on August 15th of 1945 with the formal treaty signed on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd of 1945, and was deprived of any military capability. The Potsdam Declaration was intended by the Big Three to be the legal basis for administering Japan after the war, and the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Japan, General Douglas MacArthur, landed there in September, and it served as the legal basis for the occupation's reforms. MacArthur established U.S. military bases in Japan to oversee the post-war development of the country in a period of Japanese history known as the occupation. While the Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain on the imperial throne, the Japanese constitution was completely overhauled, and the emperor's powers became strictly limited by law, and a parliamentary democracy was installed as the new form of government. When the 1947 constitution was adopted, the state of Japan was established, and the Empire of Japan was dismantled, and its overseas territories lost. Also, after the August 15th surrender of Japan in 1945, the Korean peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel into two zones of occupation, with the Soviets administering the northern half and the Americans the southern half. In 1948, as a result of Cold War tensions, the occupation zones became two sovereign states, Socialist North Korea and Capitalist South Korea. The governments of the two new Korean states both claimed to be the only legitimate Korean government, and neither accepted the border as permanent. This state of affairs led directly to the Korean War in 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25th, following clashes along the border and insurrections in the South. The Korean War was one of the most destructive conflicts of modern times, with around 3 million deaths due to the war, and proportionally a larger civilian death toll than either World War II or the Vietnam War. It caused the destruction of nearly all of Korea's major cities, and there were thousands of massacres on both sides. The same pattern of dividing a country into two different political systems and economic systems happened in Vietnam as a result of the 1954 Geneva Conference in Switzerland to settle unresolved issues from the Korean War and the First Indochina War in Vietnam, and attended by representatives from the United States, France, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the People's Republic of China, as well as from Korea and Vietnam. The Geneva Accords established North and South Vietnam with the 17th parallel as a dividing line, and the French agreed to remove their troops from North Vietnam. The agreement also stipulated that elections were to be held within 2 years to unify Vietnam under a single democratic government. These elections never happened. The non-communist puppet government set up by the French in South Vietnam refused to sign. The United States also refused to sign on, with the belief that national elections would result in an overwhelming victory for the communist Ho Chi Minh, who had so decisively defeated the French colonialists. Within a year, the United States helped establish a new anti-communist government in South Vietnam and began giving it financial and military assistance. The first Gulf of Tonkin incident took place on August 2nd of 1964 between ships of North Vietnam and the United States, and was an international confrontation after which the United States engaged more directly in the Vietnam War. While there was a second Gulf of Tonkin incident alleged to have happened on August 4th of 1964, this second occurrence has long been said not to have taken place, and there are the people who believe the first Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened either. Whether or not the Gulf of Tonkin incidents actually happened, they were used as an excuse for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed by Congress on August 7th of 1964, giving President Lyndon B. Johnson authority to help any Southeast Asian country whose government was considered to be in jeopardy of communist aggression and was considered the legal justification for the beginning of open warfare with North Vietnam and the deployment of American troops to Southeast Asia, of which, with the institution of the draft, there were over 500,000 troops sent by 1966. President Gerald Ford had announced the end of the Vietnam War for the United States almost 11 years later in a speech he gave at Tulane University on April 23rd of 1975, after Congress voted against his request for a $722 million aid package for South Vietnam, though money was given for evacuation. The fall of Saigon took place on April 30th of 1975, with the entry of North Vietnamese forces into the city, and right after the helicopters of Operation Frequent Wind evacuated Americans, at-risk South Vietnamese, and third country nationals from the capital of South Vietnam. North and South Vietnam were subsequently reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam all the way through to the present day. It certainly looks like Japan and other countries have been manipulated throughout our modern history by foreign interests, with events orchestrated and manipulated by unseen influencers for desired outcomes and the destruction of the original civilization, and setting the stage for future events to bring us to the world we live in today. Was Imperial Japan of the 1868 Meiji Restoration what is defined as controlled opposition? Controlled opposition is a strategy in which an individual, organization, or movement is covertly controlled or influenced by a third party, and the controlled entity's true purpose is something other than its publicly stated purpose. The controlled entity serves a role of mass deception, surveillance, or political and social manipulation. The controlled party is portrayed as being in opposition to the interests of the controlling party. Who was involved in the creation of the new civilization and narrative? Top candidates for this New World Order reset activity include Catholic orders like the Jesuit and Franciscan missionaries, the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, and the royal houses of Europe. And their secret activities involved in this were carried out with the involvement of the highest echelons of secret societies, including the Freemasons, Oddfellows, Knights of Pythias, and the Skull and Bones Society. The definition of Zionism we are most familiar with is that of an international movement originally for the establishment of a Jewish national or religious community in Palestine and later for the support of modern Israel. But what if Zionism was the vehicle by which the world's controllers, known by names such as the Illuminati, Cabal, Globalist Elite, and Bilderbergers, planned and executed the corporate structure for their global takeover of the world's finances, resources, and people? They are a small number of related elitist family bloodlines, hidden in different nationalities and religions, with elaborately constructed plans for world domination. We are living in a strange time of in-between right now, but I personally believe the world's elitist controllers will not get away with all that they have done, and that their days are numbered.